This is Art Television.
So today I'd like to talk about another subject which is very important to us, and I'll just introduce it with, so it doesn't give it away straight away, and introduce it with a verse from the Buddha. Unfortunately I haven't got it in Pali, but I've got it in English, and it's a very strong verse, so you'll get the idea of the subject of the talk this morning very quickly. Every person who is born with an axe in their mouth. A fool who uses abusive or harsh language cuts themselves and others with that axe. So that's pretty strong, isn't it? Pretty strong. Every person who is born with an axe in their mouth. A fool who uses abusive or harsh language cuts themselves and others with that axe. But I always add, but we don't need to use the axe, and that's what this talk is about, not using the axe. And I know Ajahn Brahm, he'd probably update this from axe to the chainsaw. Every person is born with a chainsaw in their mouth. And it's true that we can, with our speech, we can really cause a lot of harm and hurt and damage to other people. And especially with children, this can be the case too, from teachers, from parents, from other children too at school. Remember school. The school children can be pretty tough. So what we say is very important, and how we say it is very important. So they both go together actually. It's not just what we say, because sometimes people say things which are not terribly offensive in themselves, in itself, but the way they say it, wow, it really, hits home. So this is, of course, I think, what was the subject area do you think this is? I think right speech, yeah. So it's a very important aspect of the path. The Buddha devotes a whole factor of the Noble Eightfold Path to right speech, and which means it's something very important for our practice. And of course everybody knows speech is where it all starts from, where the defilements actually often become very evident. And speech is what leads often to violence and difficulties between people. So right speech, of course, is the third aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. And it's good to remember that we need the whole of the Eightfold Path. They all work together in a way. They all work together and they build on each other. But really, for right speech, there are 4 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path that are absolutely essential for us to develop right speech. They support right speech. And I've spoken about the first 2, you may not remember, right view. I don't know what I called it, the talk, probably reality check is what I usually think of when I talk about right view. And the second factor, right intention, which I think I was talking about it as emotional intelligence. But right view is the view of reality that an enlightened being has. And one of those aspects, and it covers, of course, the fact that giving is important. It has a great effect. Not only giving, but there's karma, rebirth. There are other worlds, other lives, and that there are enlightened beings that have experienced reality directly and can tell others about it. But the aspect that affects us here, of course, with speech, is the fact that there's karma. We make karma by what we say. We make karma by what we do, and we make karma by what we think. But speech is one of the biggies. It really is a big one, where we're making a lot of karma. And this is not only, of course, just by speaking. It's these days, it's all the written aspects of it too, and maybe even videos, that sort of thing. So the internet has really enhanced the potential for wrong speech and right speech too. So that's very good. So hopefully today, on the internet, live streaming something from right speech. So that's good. And the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path that supports right speech is right intention. Because right intention is where we're coming from, as I called it, the emotional intelligence. So if you're coming from letting go, not trying to get, giving, this is nekama. And if coming from loving kindness and from, which is non-ill will, sometimes they call it avyapada. If we're coming from non-harming or hurting, this is compassion, then our speech, if we've got these three qualities in our mind, our speech won't be something that hurts others. It won't be hurting us as well. And that's the important thing to remember too when the Buddha mentions the axe cuts themselves and others. So what is he meaning by that? They're making karma that will come back to that person later, maybe this life or in future lives. So this factor is very important for the whole Noble Eightfold Path, how we're practicing it, where we're coming from. So, and of course, a crucial factor for speech, our speech, is right effort. This is samavayama. So we have to know if something is negative, unwholesome, and we have to know what is positive, what is wholesome. So if we're speaking and we're aware, this is something unwholesome, this is something negative, then we can do something about it. Then we can can let go of that and develop positive or wholesome speech. So this is very, very important, because if we're not aware of where we're coming from, whether it's negative or positive, we can say all sorts of things and then later think, oh, that wasn't good. That wasn't good. And as I often emphasize with right effort, if we actually develop the habit to speak, in a positive way, in a wholesome way, it actually creates that habit that helps us let go of the negative tendencies in our speech. Because this is basically it. We're creatures of habit. Of course, mindfulness is what is getting us out of those habits. But if we have habits, it's better to have good habits. And so if we can create, by right effort, positive, wholesome ways of speaking, not only to others. Who do you think is very important we speak to quite often? Ourselves. Sometimes the things we say to ourselves, we'd never dare say to anybody else. And that's not very kind, because that's not samma sankappa, that's not right intention. Because we need to be kind and understanding, particularly with ourselves, and forgiving too. So this is essential, this aspect of, knowing whether something is wholesome or wholesome, positive, or negative, unwholesome. And it's the essence of the teachings that our practice is something for us on an individual basis. So this is a very, very important aspect of the teaching. If we cannot recognise something as positive or negative, it's really difficult to do anything about it. We won't do anything about it. And the other factor that I'd like to mention, of course, and I just mentioned it, is right mindfulness. If we are not present, if we're just coming from automatic, we can say anything, and we won't be very aware of it. Maybe later the mindfulness will kick in and we'll say, oh my God, what did I say? I didn't really mean that. And the interesting thing with speech is you can't rewind it. You can't take it back. Once it's made the impression, that's in there, actually. So with mindfulness, we know what we're saying, we know what we're doing, and hopefully know what we're thinking, And so we can come off this autopilot, automatic, and then have choice about what we say. Choose to say positive things, or we can choose to say negative things. It is up to us. So those four factors we really need all the time when we speak. We really need all the time when we do any action, actually. We need to have a view, come from right view. We need to come from a good place. This is right intention, emotional intelligence. And we need to be able to distinguish the negative from the positive, the unwholesome from the wholesome. This is right effort. And we also need just to be aware of what we're doing, because if we're not, we haven't got much choice. We haven't got much potential for developing right speech and letting go of wrong speech. So now I'll talk a little bit about the types of wrong speech. I don't think we really need it. Most people know all the types of wrong speech, but I think, when I look at the way the Buddha presents, speech, I think it's pretty comprehensive. It'd be interesting if anybody else comes up with other types of wrong speech, actually. But the way the Buddha divides speech, wrong speech, is lying as wrong speech. We had the precept. We took the precept, musawada, veramani, sikkhapadang samadhiyami. And of course, divisive speech. This is dividing others from other people. So we're deliberately doing that, trying to divide a person from another person. And this can, I think the most common manifestation of this is talking behind their backs, talking behind a person's back, and then giving the other person a bad impression. But it's usually with this deliberate intention to divide them, maybe to get the person who you're dividing from the other person, get them on board with yourself, so that they're your friend. So that's the second type of wrong speech. And harsh speech is the third. This is harsh or abusive speech, when people insult others. And I go into it in a little bit more detail, but I think everybody knows this one. And it's quite interesting, because on the plane, when I went to Townsville recently, the other day, and when we were landing, I was sitting next to two men, and every second word was a swear word, but they weren't aware of it. It's sort of like, and it was also a sort of way of bonding, strangely enough. That's what I thought, sort of to say we're on the same page. And I thought, wow. If you said to them, this is harsh speech, or rough speech, I don't think they would understand at all, because they're not mindful of it at all. It's become, sort of a way of relating, telling other people, yeah, well, I'm on the same page. So very interesting, actually. And the fourth type of wrong speech is gossip, sometimes called idle chatter, but I prefer gossip because it gives much more of the sense of the danger in it, because gossip is something that can be very, very destructive. And of course, in terms of practicing right speech, the first aspect is to refrain from wrong speech, not do that. And that is really good karma, the Buddha said, to intentionally not say the things that one would like to say out of anger, irritation, or whatever it is. Intentionally not to lie, not to use divisive speech, not to try and divide people. Intentionally not to use harsh speech, and intentionally not to gossip. But the other aspect of right speech, of course, is developing the positive side of those different types of speech. So, lies, the opposite of lies? Truth, yeah, telling the truth. And the opposite of divisive speech? Inclusive or harmonious speech, unifying speech, that's good. And the opposite of a harsh or abusive speech? Kind, yes, gentle, kind, pleasant. And the opposite of gossip? So, I like that, that's good. Usually we say meaningful speech, something that's related, it's got a bit of substance. And also, often gossip's about other people, isn't it, really? So about ourselves, actually something meaningful that connects with other people from our own experience. So now it's time, after a lot of talking, to tell a Nasrudin story, which is about speech. Nasrudin was a Sufi, holy person, and a very interesting teacher. Perhaps he was a real person, I think, in Turkey in the 1200s or something like that. And one day Nasrudin had made an appointment with a philosopher, and I presume they were going to have an interesting discussion or debate, the philosopher and Nasrudin. I don't know. I think the philosopher would have lost the debate, actually. And he came. He knocked on Nasrudin's door. Nasrudin didn't answer because he'd forgotten the appointment. And the philosopher was outraged. How dare he? Probably he was a well-known philosopher too. So he wrote on the door, "Stupid oaf, stupid oaf." And then Nasruddin came home, the philosopher went away, and he came home, and there he saw, "Stupid oaf," written on the... Ah, the philosopher's been. Oh, I forgot the appointment. So he rushed to his house, and he said, "Oh, I saw you'd come. You'd left your name on the door." So I don't know that the philosopher would have been any... He probably wasn't feeling better disposed to Nasruddin after that. "You wrote your name on the door." So you left my... Yes, good. It's very often, often too, when we say something negative, people will come back with a negative too. So I call this instant karma. I don't know what the philosopher said. Probably hit him, I think. So, yes. And we know that... lying, all these sorts of wrong speech, they cause enormous harm. But good, right speech can cause a lot of benefit. And it's the same with the written presentations that appear in videos, images, and also on the internet, which really speeds everything up, doesn't it? It really makes gossip go around the world in no time flat. So we know... in great detail what's going on with Harry and Meghan, Prince Harry. It just seems to be, so much. I don't know how many people are that interested, but still, seems to be. So, and there's, of course, very negative aspects of the internet. Hate mail, I think I remember once giving a presentation at a school, a Christian school, and it was a Buddhist, a Muslim woman, and a Christian woman. And the Muslim woman was telling me how she got hate mail. Actually, I remember that. She get hate mail quite regularly. I thought, gee, that's sad. And also, we have that sort of hate mail on the social media too, Facebook and so on, where kids get bullied on the internet. And it's interesting that this actually, according to what I've seen, on YouTube, of course, that it leads to... it's a cause, a prominent cause for suicide among young people, this sort of bullying on the internet. So, refraining from false speech, that's the one level, developing the truth. But it's always interesting to look into lying, because there's many things that I can see, and these are just interesting questions for us to ask ourselves. And the response will inform our practice. Does lying cause harm? Does it cause problems? Or is it only when we get caught? Because many people think that, don't they? It's only when we get caught that it's a problem. But of course it already has created the karma, hasn't it? That negative karma. Because we have deliberately, intentionally trying to deceive somebody. Whether they deceive, we don't know. They may think, "Oh, come on." They may not say anything, but it's that deliberate intention. And other aspects of lying, of course, it's an interesting phenomena too. It includes lying about how we feel. When people say, "How are you?" And say, "Oh, I'm fine." Sometimes the way people say, "Oh, I'm fine," it's pretty obvious that they're not. They're having a bad day or whatever. So this may be, this keeping up appearances may also be an aspect of lying, I think, that is so common, we forget about it. And that reminds me of I think it was one of the members' children here, actually, I think it was. Their mother or their father had said, "If anybody calls, tell them I'm not at home." Of course, that was a lie. So what does the child do? When somebody rings, he says, "Is Mummy at home?" "No, they're not at home. They told me that they're not at home." So children are great, So very early on we're conditioning, children to lie. We get used to it, a level of lying that is interesting. And of course, the other aspect of it is we can lie to ourselves, because we don't like certain aspects of ourselves. So we don't, we sort of lie to ourselves where we're actually coming from. We're not being honest with ourselves. That's actually the worst in a way, because in terms of spiritual development, we need that honesty, that truthfulness in order to grow. Because the whole path is a path of truth. So if we're lying to ourselves about ourselves, or any other type of lying, this is undermining that commitment to truth, to discovering the truth. And of course there is white lies, that we tell when it's difficult. Sometimes it's difficult for me too, actually. Sometimes when people ask you things and if you tell them exactly the truth, it will hurt their feelings. But this is what the Buddha did about dealing with not hurting people's feelings. This is his advice. Of course, we've got to remember it's coming from a Buddha, so it's a pretty high standard. We may not measure up to this, but it's very good because it informs us, gives us some standards, for when we speak to people and we don't want to hurt their feelings. So the Buddha, he said that if something were untrue, incorrect, and not beneficial, he would not say it. So if it wasn't beneficial to the other person, so something that's untrue, incorrect, and not beneficial, he wouldn't say it. If it were true, correct, but still not beneficial, he wouldn't say it. But, and the third option, of course, if something were true, correct, and beneficial, he would say it at the right time. Whether the person liked what he said, or whether they didn't like what he said. Because he knew that even sometimes when we hear things pointed out, our faults, our imperfections, there are some imperfections, then we can learn and we can grow. And of course, if a Buddha points it out, someone like that, usually the person that he would say that to would be somebody that had respect, that would listen to his words and look into them. Because the Buddha says in the Dhamma, a very interesting verse, it's great, he says, if a wise person points out our faults, we should think of it as like someone pointing out a treasure, nidana. Wow. But it's very good to keep in mind that he says wise person. Many other people that are not wise will point out our faults, so we shouldn't pay too much attention to them. But if somebody is wise, if there's somebody that we do respect, then we should look into it. So this is something, this is how the Buddha practiced. And later I'll mention some of the guidelines he gave for right speech. And of course the second type, the divisive speech, or sometimes they call it malicious speech, Pisunavacha in Pali. And this is a very common one that in politics it's very common. It's part of the game rules, I think. And their aim is to divide people from other people. And the interesting thing the Buddha points out is if it's true that still we have the intention to divide people, it is still creating this bad karma, negative karma of wrong speech. More so, even more so if it's untrue. If it's a complete lie, then you've got two, haven't you? You've got lying and also you've got this divisive speech. So it's double bad karma. And the Buddha uses a nice phrase for this sort of speech. It's like verbal daggers. Verbal daggers. Isn't that good? You've got the axe in the mouth, verbal daggers. It's sort of giving you an idea, isn't it? It sort of sounds very... Because if you keep these images, it's very interesting. The Buddha uses very extreme images that are hard to forget. That's the reason I think he uses them. Because if you think of an axe in the mouth, it stays with you. If you think of a dagger in the mouth, you think, wow, yes. And then, if we have that in mind, we think, oh, I'll be careful about using this axe. I'll be careful about using a dagger, this knife. So, another teaching the Buddha gave on how, we can relate to other people, or how different types of people relate to other people, is he gave a teaching about the speech of a sage and a fool. This is a sappurisa and the fool. And it's very informative, because when I read this list I think, yes, sometimes I'm the sage, sometimes I'm the fool. And just see what you think of this list. So this is about divisive speech, how we speak about others. And also in this context too, in this teaching he mentions oneself too, how one speaks about oneself to others. So he says that a fool talks about himself unasked. He'll talk about himself and his good qualities, or her good qualities, at length, in great detail, taking probably a long time. But if they're asked about their negative qualities, well, very brief, and there'll be quite a bit of rationalising. Well, I had to do it, and, they don't talk about the bad qualities. But when it comes to other people, the Buddha said, asked about the good qualities of other people, they speak briefly, they won't dwell on it and get it over very quickly. But unasked about the bad qualities of another person or persons, they'll speak for a long time and in great, great detail. So this is the speech of a fool. It's talking about themselves, their positive and negative qualities, and talking about the positive and negative qualities of others. But a sage, this is very interesting, when asked about their good qualities, will speak briefly, just give a little, idea of their good qualities. This is called humility, isn't it, really? You're not bragging or anything. But unasked about their bad qualities, they will speak at length and in detail. I don't know if that's entirely good, actually. Because, so they will not hide their shortcomings. They will not hide their shortcomings. Which reminds us, doesn't it, of the stream enterer, their inability to hide their breaking of the 5 precepts. They won't try and cover it up. So this is how a sage talks about themselves. But when it comes to talking about others, unasked, they'll speak about the good qualities of other people at great length and in detail, and maybe a few sadhus as well, I don't know. And then when they're asked about the bad qualities of other people, they only talk about it very briefly, don't go into detail, and presumably only speak from their own experience. So that's the difference between a sage and a fool. And as I say, we're probably all a bit of a mix. We're not always sages and we're not always fools, fortunately. But of course this sort of a malicious speech can also be sort of disguised, or we can be unaware of it. And so it's very good to ask where we're coming from, what we hope to gain from something, from telling this person about the other person. Are we really, is it really coming from this motivation of wanting to divide them? Maybe want to make this person our friend and alienate them, separate them from the other person. And also, maybe these backhanded compliments too can be a form of this divisive or malicious speech. So, now not last one, just a quick one about harsh and abusive speech. I mentioned that I had a very good example on the plane. But for them it wasn't probably harsh speech. They didn't recognise it as harsh speech. Quite interesting. And the opposite, developing kind and gentle speech. This is the opposite. But this harsh speech includes swearing, sarcasm, hypocrisy, being overly blunt. That can be very hurtful, cutting, belittling, criticism, bullying, blackmail, all those things. And of course it comes from a very negative state of mind, from anger, irritation, annoyance. And we always have to remember, I like to promote the idea of karma, especially in Australia, as being like a boomerang. It will come back. If it's a good good karma, then that's okay. If it's a bad karma, it will probably hit us by surprise as it comes back. And this is important to remember. This sort of harsh speech, this abusive speech. When, especially for children, And I know a friend of mine, he said one of his parents, used very harsh speech or abusive speech, really emotionally abusive. And he said he would have rather they had actually hit him than they actually spoke like this. So it's good to keep that in mind, because our children, they hear that speech over and over again, then they take it on board. So it's very good to remember that. And I like to tell a story, because we need a story now. It's a lovely story, actually, of a Greek philosopher who had a student, and he told this student that he had to pay money to anyone who insulted him. Had to pay money to anyone who insulted him. I thought it must have really created a real, people probably thought, he pays for insults, and then they'd insult him more and more. And after 3 years, the philosopher, his teacher, said to him, "That's enough. Now you're ready to go to Athens," this is in Greece actually, "and learn wisdom." So for 3 years he was being insulted and paying for it. Really interesting, really interesting. And then he goes to Athens, and as he's entering Athens, the story says, there was a certain wise man, who was sitting at the gate insulting everybody who entered the gate. I don't know if that's wise. It seems to be a good way to occasion, somebody lashing out and hitting him or even killing him maybe. But he insulted this disciple, and the disciple immediately burst into laughter. And he said, and the wise person, so-called wise person, said, "Why are you laughing when I insult you?" And he said, he said, "Because for 3 years I had to pay for this. Now I'm getting it free." So this is a great story, because the underlying thing in a lot of wrong speech, isn't it, apart from anger, is also coming from the sense of I, me, myself. And so when somebody insults us, wow, it comes up big time. And so for 3 years he'd been, sort of deluged with this. And so he'd really come to terms with speech and this sense of the ego, being affected by what others say. So he'd learnt a big, big lesson, I think, there. But I don't think we need to pay for it. But I think if we can see it, especially when we react and the sense of self comes up, this is interesting, as it does. Because the Buddha talks about praise and blame. And both of them actually see the ego, the sense of I, me, come up in a big way. So it's a good teaching on to look into this sense of self. And the last one, I've got to finish soon, so I haven't got to the 2 major areas actually. Refraining from gossip, and that's developing meaningful speech. And so this is, as I said, it's very, we all know what gossip is, repeating often what other people say. But it can be, it's usually repeating something that we've heard. And so it can be very damaging, and we can see on the internet how it can affect people in a very negative way, how their careers can be destroyed, how their lives, and some people can commit suicide because of it. And always we should keep in mind what the Buddha, I'll mention it in a minute actually, so I'll leave it for there. Some of the standards of the Buddha, but the main one here is, of course, with gossip, is this useful? Is it beneficial to myself or to the other person to know this? Most gossip, it isn't. And the main reason for the gossip is just to be with another person, and you just, sort of friendship often and so on. So this sort of speech, we can just ask ourselves, is this useful? Is it something factual even? Because a lot of gossip isn't, it's not in our area of experience, we're just repeating what we've heard. And one of the things that the Buddha had high standards, and he said, is it connected with Dhamma and the discipline, the Dhamma and the rules of behaviour, especially for monks and nuns? And this is even better, is it accompanied by reason? Gossip? Well, and is it moderate and full of sense? Now that's the words of a Buddha, of course. But if we think of those criteria, then gossip, puts gossip in, we probably think there's no area for gossip, and that'd be good. Of course, if there was no gossip, I think many of the newspapers would close down. Closed down, and the internet would be there'd be much less on the internet. So the principles for developing right speech, and this is what I call the tests for skillful speech or right speech. And this is really important from the Buddha. It's actually the basis for ethical behaviour, how we speak, how we act, and also how we think. And the Buddha he was giving this advice to his son, Rahula, Prince Rahula, or Venerable Rahula, sorry, and he was only 7 years old at this stage, but it's a fantastic teaching, which is the basis of all ethics, actually. It's so very, very useful for me, and I'm sure for most people. First thing to consider when we're speaking, acting, or even thinking, does it harm me or does it harm others? Or does it benefit me, does it benefit others, or both? So we're looking at harm and benefit. Is my speech, what I'm going to say, of harm? Will it harm somebody else, harm me? Is it of benefit to somebody else, benefit to me? And then to look at the motivation, where we're coming from. Is this a positive thing, positive speech, or negative speech? Where we're coming from is very important. And then the Buddha, being so complete, actually says, what are the consequences after we've said what we've said? Said, are the results pleasant or painful? And the interesting thing with this criteria, whether something's harmful or beneficial, where we're coming from, is it a good place or not? And the consequences, whether the results are pleasant or painful. The Buddha says we should, before we do something, say something, I don't know about think something, we should use this criteria, these three things, when we're doing it and afterwards. That's quite a lot, especially when you think his son was 7 years old when he was telling him this. This is a fantastic teaching, but you wonder how much a 7-year-old would take it in. So, and the other things that the Buddha mentions, this is actually more particularly in terms of when one is, we say in English, telling someone off, and they call it avada. You're giving some guidance to somebody, or you're pointing out something. That's a better way, isn't it? Pointing out something to somebody. And he says right speech on this occasion. And this is a very good criteria. Actually, I mention them again at the end in a different form. It's got to be the right time. Not while somebody's in with other people. They really, really get upset if you tell them off, if you point something out in a public situation. And it can cause a lot of hurt for the other person. And they can get angry and very upset. And they won't hear what you're saying to them, which may be very useful for them. And the Buddha says we should talk about facts, what's true, what's actually what we actually know to be the case. And we should consider, is this beneficial for the other person to hear? Like we mentioned before, the speech of a Buddha, he always reflected if something was beneficial for the other person. And he said the next thing is to speak gently and softly, so not to shout at them or speak in an irritated tone. And the last one, speaking from loving kindness. This is when we're pointing out something to somebody. As you know, it's a very difficult thing to do, because people get very sensitive and they can take it the wrong way. But if we have all these criteria, speaking at the right time, speaking what's factual, thinking of the benefit of the other person, and speaking in a soft, gentle way, and also from loving kindness, that's got a much better chance of succeeding if we're pointing out something we need to point out. One of the other criteria the Buddha mentions in another list of 5, actually, for a person who is about to point out something. Do we do the same thing? If we're doing the same thing that we're pointing out for another person, that is hypocrisy. So it's very good to reflect, actually, and especially where we're coming from. But one of the things I was just going to mention to finish off, and it's a very important area, I mentioned there were 4 things, 4 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path that support right speech, and that is, of course, right view, as I mentioned, right intention, where we're coming from, and also right effort, knowing the difference between the positive and the negative, the wholesome and the unwholesome, and also mindfulness. So I'd like to mention mindfulness a bit more, because it's a very important aspect that allows us to be aware of our speech. And I spent 3 months, quite a while ago, at Sayadaw U Tejaniya's monastery, and it's called Shui U Min Center in Myanmar. And he emphasises Chittanupassana, watching the mind, but particularly watching the reactions of the mind to whatever we experience. And one of the interesting, and particularly the defilements, watching the defilements that come up, recognising them. He has a lovely book called Don't Look Down on the Defilements. They will laugh at you. They are. They're always laughing at us. And they often get a good upper hand. One of the things that they emphasised there, in most meditation centres, it was a meditation centre, they said, noble silence, noble silence. No, you must speak to other people. I want you to be mindful as you speak. And that is something quite interesting, because you don't hear that very much at a meditation centre. But because it's such an important area, it's very useful to develop an awareness of how we're speaking, what we're saying, where we're coming from. Because, of course, it's Chittanupassana. This is the part of the Satipatthana, the foundations of mindfulness, focuses of mindfulness, so that's what Ajahn Brahm uses. And it's the area of being aware of the state of the mind, what state the mind is in, whether there are positive qualities, negative qualities in the mind. So it's very useful, you learn a lot. So they encourage the meditators to speak to each other, but to bring this mindfulness to it. And so then we can learn a lot about our speech, we can learn a lot about where we're coming from. And it gives us, when we're aware of what we're doing, it gives us the choice not to say things, not to, tell a lie or exaggerate. What's the difference sometimes between exaggeration? What's the line? I think that's the word. The line between lying and exaggeration. That's an interesting one. Or not to say something negative, divisive, not to say something harsh, not to say something that's gossip. That's probably the hardest one. Because it seems fairly innocent, actually. So when we actually are aware of our speech, it actually addresses a lot of the defilements of greed, hatred and delusion that are there, that come up in our speech, in our conversations with other people. Often wrong speech is coming from this, particularly from negativity, ill will, irritation, annoyance, all those sorts of things. But often it's coming from delusion too, from the sense of me, I, and all this. And so this is actually one of the driving forces for wrong speech, as is, delusion in the sense of misunderstanding what another person says. It's incredible. I think 9/10 of arguments probably are about misunderstandings, just different, we're using different words and we've misunderstood each other. So it's a very important aspect of it. And this training to see the defilements and then to say no to them is actually central to the Buddha's teaching, and to develop happiness from that. To be happy that we're able to say no to greed. I mentioned Chadstone, the Chadstone test, can you walk from one side of the Chadstone shopping centre, big shopping centre near here, to the other side without buying anything? And you still have your money and your credit card with you. If you pass that test, that's pretty amazing. Chadstone will be very disappointed. Very disappointed. They'll send someone here. He's bad for business. But so this ability to say no is actually something that leads to our happiness and to strength of mind. Sometimes people feel like, because in defilements they tell you, you've got to get this. If you don't get this, it's just the right colour, it's the right size. I should get it now. The defilements will always tell us to go for it, whether it be greed, whether it be hatred. They deserve it. They deserve it. I'm right. They're wrong. or all these sorts of things. So the defilements will always encourage us, but our ability to say no to them is a great strength, and it's the essence of ethics, actually. But to actually get happiness from them, fantastic. I said no to it. And this is quite a strong thing that I would usually say yes to. So, and one of my favourite sayings in this line is from Bhante G, and he's talking, do you know who Bhante G is? Bhante Gunaratana, the famous monk, Sri Lankan monk who lives in America, who wrote the famous book Mindfulness in Plain English. And he's done a number of other books, actually, that are wonderful, they're very good. And he's a lovely monk. He used to travel quite a lot here and came to the BSV, I think he was here 2014 or something the last time. I remember I was here when he was here. And he says, and this is true of all the defilements, but he's talking about anger, he says, simply refuse to let your anger tell you what to say. Because that's what it's doing, isn't it? It's telling us what to say. It's greed, it's telling us what to do. Get it? And this ability to say, no, I won't do it, is very good, because it's really liberating, because this is part of a very strong habit pattern, very strong conditioning of these defilements. And our ability to say no is really if we do it in the right way, it'll give rise to happiness and a feeling like, wow, I'm getting some freedom. I'm getting some space in my life. And Bhante G, he recommends for people, before they respond with anger, is to take some deep breaths. And he says 2 minutes. I think that's a long time. That's some anger, actually. It must be big anger. He says 30 in-breaths and out-breaths. I also, I use myself, and I mention to others, the 4-7-8 breath that Dr. Andrew Weil teaches on the YouTube. That is very good too for any of these states, whether it be anger, anxiety, all these states. It's very useful for, because it gives a bit of a space. It calms the mind down. It breaks the thinking that's feeding the anger, and therefore it can bring some peace to the mind for a short time. And you notice when you're meditating, this is one of Ajahn Chah's suggestions too, that if there's a lot of thinking, take a few deep breaths, 2 or 3 deep breaths, and you notice the thinking really does subside very, very quickly. It can come back, but this was, is very obvious actually. And when the thinking is reduced, then all that reacting, all the anger or whatever emotion is being fed by that thinking, whether it be depression, anxiety, whether it be anger, subsides. So very useful. So these, and as I say, this speech is a place where you'll see the defilements come up in a big, big way. And when we're working with them, this is a very important part of the path. And as I say, to get some choice, to get some freedom from the defilements. And we can make, what helps actually with speech, particularly if we've got strong habits, negative habits, is to make a resolution or a determination. We won't say that or say it in that way. And maybe we can even do some more reprogramming and say, we'll talk in a soft way, and we'll choose our words well, and we'll bring harmony to the situation. Something like that. So this is called like a resolution or a determination, programming the mind against the negative speech, but also programming it to bring up positive speech as well. And yes, so I think I'll just end there because I'm over time. We started a little late. Just to remind you of that test. This is, I think Bhante G had this one actually, but it's a combination of some of the main points that the Buddha mentions. It's a test of skillful speech, he says. Is it true? That's important. Is it kind? Is it beneficial? Or does it harm myself or others? Is this the right time to say it? So those things, they're a very good test. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it beneficial or harmful? And is it the right time? If we can remember those, then our speech will be good speech, right speech. It will be speech that promotes harmony and connection with people. A speech that will develop meaning and purpose in our life. It'll be speech that lets go of negative states of mind and will help us on the path. So that our speech becomes, as the Buddha said, full of reason and sense. And he often mentions this sort of speech, very good speech, right speech, is something people like to record, remember. So I'd like to encourage yourself, all of you and myself actually, to develop right speech, good speech, to not use the axe in the mouth, not use the dagger we have in our mouths, and instead to develop right speech, good speech, speech that actually benefits us, and so that we can grow on the path, the Noble Eightfold Path. So thank you very much. So are there any questions? We have a few minutes, but I've gone over time. Yes, Dr. Jaya. Yes.
First of all, to continue this right speech, at 12 o'clock we have a Dhamma discussion later.
Oh, very good. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, that's good. Dhamma discussion at 12:30?
Yes, yes.
Yes, for the lay people. Yes, this is going to be, it's good.
The question, Bhante, I mean, Buddha's time, the communication by oral tradition, there was nothing written. So when you say right speech today, it's really right communication or interact with each other. So which includes, as you said, social media, what's written on papers, all these things come under that category. Because you can do a lot of harm by fake news.
Yes, fake news.
Character assassinations, slandering, articles. So that's all come under this particular noble thing. Okay.
Oh, that's very good. Yes, that's true. Yes, I think that's good to keep in mind because they have big impact these days.
Yeah.
Very big. And as I mentioned, the when I was doing the teens group, I think last year, and one of the issues for teens is bullying at school, but part of that bullying is on the internet. And there were some really very nice little, because you give video clips for the teens, videos on the effect that this bullying on social media has on children. So that especially if they get a lot of it, then they can take it on board, and then they can feel negative about themselves and maybe even suicide. Evidently, that's quite a prominent cause for suicide in young people. So. They say the second cause of death for people between, I think, 17 and 34 is the second cause is suicide. So suicide is very, very strong in that age group. So you're looking at the late teens, 20s, early 30s. People often suicide in that age group. And of course, when we have a bit more experience, we'll have less tendency to do it. So so I'm very keen on those people who promote a youth suicide prevention. And I showed a video some time ago that showed a man who was jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge when he was 19, and how he survived and then actually promoted. Went out to schools and youth groups and taught them about his experience. He can speak from his own experience so that they can avoid going the same way that he went. He survived. Very miraculous, actually. Ah, right. There we are. I think...
We're making you walk, mate. It's okay. We're trying to look after your health.
No. That's it. Exercise. Exercise, yes.
They're actually a loaded question.
Yes.
First is, it just reminds me the quick chat that we had around ancient philosophy and Stoicism.
Yes.
That's a good overlap around... There's a philosophy around Stoicism that says, Stoicism, on the ancient Greek philosophy, that says, don't speak the truth, or at least don't lie. And the second part is, just don't talk about anyone, simply. Just don't talk about anyone.
Actually, that's very good. Yeah, it's very good.
But the question, actually, it's not really a question. I'm just reminding the gentleman, the young man who tried to commit suicide from the one you just mentioned, Bhante.
Yeah,
tried to commit suicide from the Golden Bridge in San Francisco.
Yeah.
He is the only survivor from that jump, and he now goes to schools, and he says that the only thing he wanted there, if someone had stopped to ask him how he was, he would have a jump. He stayed at the bridge for a little while, just waiting someone to ask him, how are you? And nobody did it. And that's, I mean, not the reason he jumped, but that's, he would have avoided there. So it's a statement more than a question.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Yes, because he says if somebody had said, "Are you okay, kid?" that would have been good for him and could have stopped him, because he said even when he was getting off the bus to jump over the rail, he didn't want to do it. He wanted to live. And he said when he hit the water and went straight down 70 to 80 feet, he said his depression had vanished. I'm not surprised, because it's just the drive to survive then, because he had shattered the lower vertebrae in the spine, so his legs weren't working, so he had to swim with his arms 70 or 80 feet to get to the surface. And then he came to the surface, and then he was sinking because his shoes, his probably joggers, full of water, and he was going down. And then this thing starts circling around him, and you think, oh my God, it's a shark, and he's hitting out. And then he realised it's a sea lion that's actually keeping him afloat. Isn't that amazing? And then the Coast Guard come and rescue him and tell him he's the only person this year at least who's survived. So very good. But a very important thing you mentioned, and the Buddha often used it, was with speech. I didn't say it, and it's very important actually, is that we can remain silent. It's not easy. A Buddha can do it, but it's not easy because people can misinterpret silence, and they can find that very upsetting or insulting, and take it personally, to say the least. But that is an option. If we don't want to buy into something, we can remain silent. You need strength.
No, there are lots of comments, Ajahn, from online. Many of them very grateful for the talk.
Yep.
We have two quick questions, if you have maybe time for two short answers. The first question is, should I explain or defend myself when aggressive people lie and blame me? Or lie about me and blame me for things?
Wow. Should I defend myself when aggressive people lie and blame me? Wow, that's really tough. That's very tough. I think in those situations, one just has to see, if it's going to make things worse, actually, and put one in a more difficult situation. Oftentimes when we are in those situations, it may be better, this is what I feel, just to walk away. Walk away. Because it sounds like if the person's very aggressive, you defending yourself is going to buy into the aggressor and the defender, or aggressor and victim relationship, So I would just walk away, because nothing. They're not interested in the truth. They're not interested in hearing your side of the truth anyway. So I think you'd have to gauge. But if somebody's aggressive, then I think that's pretty good grounds for just walking away. Just don't make waves. There's no. What do they say? There's no communication with fools. When somebody's really aggressive and angry, there's no point. You can't talk sense to them. So it'll probably only end up to your own disadvantage, I would say. But we'll have to see. All right. And now, if you'd like to, those who would like to, can pay respects to the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Thank you.